Welcome to the next installment of the Horizon Knowledge Series, keeping BIM in sync during facilities operations, building on the last installment of the building information management and facilities data. Just before we get started, I hand things over to Sean. Once again, all the recordings are now being uploaded to YouTube. The first 3 are there already, and this one will be uploaded tomorrow. I will once again send out an email with the recording to everybody so you can go back and watch them and answer any questions you may have. If you have any questions that you're sitting on throughout the broadcast, come put them in the questions tab, and we will get to them at the end. Or if there's any that you have following rewatching the recording after, send me an email. My email will be at the end of the slideshow, as well as Kelly Welch's and the information link. Any one of those will get to us, and we will get back to you with the answers to your questions, and we can see what we can do. I will put the link to the recordings in the chat as well at the end. So with all the housekeeping items done, I will hand it over to you, Sean, to get started on part 4 of the Horizon Knowledge Series.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Hopefully everyone can see my slides here. We're going to be talking about keeping BIM in sync. And what that really means today is keeping Revit, the Revit application, in sync with the Archibus FM platform. And we're talking about operations or operationally. We're not talking about the initial import of data like we talked about last week in the first session related to BIM. So now the focus today is really, once you get your FIM model that we talked about up to date, how are we going to get that information and keep it up to date ongoing on a daily basis? Now, today is the 4th series, so the fourth in a series of 10 that we're kind of focused on. We are going to be talking about BIM today. This is the second in a BIM in the BIM series. And then next time we'll be talking about preventive maintenance in Archibus, which we've called automating and tracking scheduled jobs. And we'll be talking about after that facilitating planning and justifying spend as well. So there's quite a few things coming up still that we're going to be talking about with Archibus. But for today, let's talk about this opportunity that's available to anyone who's got some new construction or renovation that's being done in BIM. Now, in the last session, we talked about a facility information model, meaning a separate model that's been contracted specifically as a product for FM, right? Something that you're going to use on a daily basis to keep the model, the FM information up to date. And so we talked about getting out of that a smooth integration of Revit into Archibus. Well, today, the idea is continuing that on a daily basis and keeping that model in sync during operations. That's what we really use the Smart Client extension for Revit for Archibus with. I mean, as we said last time, the extension for the Archibus extension is really good for operations. It doesn't really matter what you use for commissioning. In fact, it might be easier not to use it for commissioning, and you'll find that out why today. But just as a quick review from last week, there is a difference between getting a BIM model, which is potentially multiple models generated for multiple teams, and it's a form of really collaboration rather than an actual product, and the FIM, or the facility information model, which is a product. It's a file which you contracted specifically for use in operations. So I'm not going to go through this slide again today, but we just want to review it to get everyone up to speed with where we talked last time about working with a facility information model in your operations. And the reason why is because the reality for the facility information model is you need a model that will produce ultimately 2-dimensional floor plans for user bookings and requests, space utilization, emergency planning, and so on, as well as 3D equipment locations for maintenance. And we talked about that last week. So today what we're going to do is we're going to focus on that ongoing operations. How do you keep your model, your FIM model, synchronized with Archibus on a day-to-day basis? So as usual, we're going to talk about those steps, and we'll just go run through those steps with you. But there's 2 sets of steps, again, I want to talk about today. The first set of steps is, what does it look like day to day to actually keep your model synchronized? And as you can see here, we've got about 5 steps that I typically work with our customers. The first step is to open up the model and modify the objects in the model, the areas, the spaces, the equipment, and so on as needed. And that might mean that you use the Archibus commands like edit data and number, just like you would in AutoCAD with Archibus. The second step is then to take that new information and synchronize it or catalog it. Now, in some cases, you don't need to do anything because, for example, changing the area of a room or changing the location of equipment dynamically updates the Archibus database. And so there is no additional step to take after that to synchronize anything. But in some cases, there might be data or additional data that you've changed that you want to have sunk up immediately to be able to report on an Archibus. And in that case, we have a command called catalog, and you would then catalog any assets that you want to catalog, meaning areas for your internal and external gross areas, rooms for your spaces, and equipment for all of the the mechanical, plumbing, electrical equipment in the model. And the last step, that's the data step. The third step is the publishing step. That's the graphics step. So Archibus, unless you're using the new Autodesk Tandem products and Archibus integration with Autodesk, you'll have to publish those images, those two-dimensional or three-dimensional images to Archibus in order to take advantage of them with the space console or the maintenance console and so on. So, and again, of course, you have the option of integration with Autodesk. But the third step is to publish the graphic information so you can see on the floor what's going on, who's sitting where, what space is allocated to what, where is a particular piece of equipment on the floor, and so on. And then to make sure that all of your reporting is up to date, and your specifically your spatial reporting, you want to go through step 4, which is to run the update area totals command. And lastly, of course, like anything you do with any software that you use, you want to verify at the end of the day that your data is accurate. And that's the first series of steps. Day to day, what are you doing? There is a second series of steps, which is what I call the initial steps for synchronization. It means once you've got your facility information model cleaned up, prepared, set up with areas and room objects and everything else that you want in the model, how do you synchronize it with Archibus? What's the preparatory steps that you have to take initially that don't have to be repeated over and over again? They're one-time things, and those include these 5 steps here. Number 1, add the step in the business process to update a model. What that means is you have business processes for requesting space changes, for making moves, for doing construction, and so on. If you have a business process flow and you have groups involved in that, insert into that process a point where the BIM specialist or the BIM manager, whoever is responsible for updating the model, is informed of the need to make a change. And then they can open up the facility information model and make that change. So this step is really important, because if without it, the other steps aren't going to really matter, right? Because you're not going to ever keep anything up to date, because no one knows what's happening on the floor. No one knows that equipment's being changed out and so on. So the actual business process step is important to think about and how it's going to take place in your process. The second step, though, is actually related to something you can do in the software. So number 1, you want to use the properties command in Archibus in the Revit application to assign each Revit level to an Archibus building and floor. That's a one-time thing, but it lets the Revit application know that everything that you do with Archibus in there is related to a specific floor, and that gets pushed back into Archibus with that building and floor included. The third step, and this is probably the most important one at the beginning, at the initial outset of synchronization, is mapping the Revit database to the Archibus database. I think a lot of clients I talk to don't realize that Revit is a database. And that's one of the things you have to be kind of aware of in the beginning, is that there are what we would call tables and fields of information stored separately in the Revit file apart from the parametric objects. So you can actually place an object, delete an object, but the data record for the object can still exist in the Revit database. And it's that database that you want to be able to map back to the Archibus database, because it's the data from that database that's going to be pushed back and forth. So one of the things you need to do is you need to map, number 1, objects in the model to tables in Archibus. Archibus already has a default mapping, which says, Revit area objects map back to the rooms table or the gross area table. Room objects map back to the room table. Mechanical specialty equipment and furniture systems map back to the equipment table, and so on. So those mappings kind of exist already, but you need to verify that that's how you want to map them as well. And so you should always just double check those. And then secondly, I see a spelling mistake here, I think. But secondly, you want to map the parameters in the database to Archibus fields. So parameters are really just fields of information in Revit that you're storing, and they're called parameters. But actually, if we, in terms of a database, we would call them fields. It's a value of a property. So one of the things you have to do is make sure that the fields get mapped. Now, this is a major difference between the Archibus extension for AutoCAD and the Archibus extension for Revit. In AutoCAD, the mapping is done by layer. So each layer represents a data table automatically. And you can add tables, you can add layers in AutoCAD. But in Revit, it's not a layer that we're using, but the object and the parameter itself. So when you map those parameters, that's going to determine what the primary key field in the Revit model is, what the additional fields are, what the classification fields are. You can choose any of those parameters, and as long as that parameter is mapped or has a mapping corresponding field in the database, Archibus will push that data back and forth and keep it synchronized. So number 3, this mapping step is an important step to get done in advance. And like we talked about in the previous session, having a BIM execution plan for facilities management will help you make sure that mapping is consistent from one model and one vendor or supplier to the next. Because ultimately, all the models that you get are going to be different based on the vendors and suppliers, but the facility information model should have the same consistent information and data with the same parameters, and that's what's great about shared parameters and so on. So step 4 is set up your publishing. You might have to modify some of the way that Archibus publishes. You might have to specify the layers for 2-dimensional publishing. You might have to specify what objects will show up in what format in the Archibus Space Console. So those things you should do at least once at the beginning. And then lastly, of course, is the initial cataloging process. You want to push all that data into Archibus for your areas, your rooms and equipment and so on. Okay, but once these steps are done, you can go back and day to day worry about these daily steps of modification, cataloging, and publishing. So let me just go ahead and show you that now. I'm going to hop into Revit. We'll start out with the day-to-day process, right? The day-to-day process, like we said, is modifying areas, space, and equipment. So what I would normally do is I'd open up our facility information model like we had before. As you can see, this is the bim.rvt file, so just bim.revit is the file name. And one of the first things I would do is just catalog everything in case there's any changes, okay? So there's a command called catalog. If your data has been correctly mapped from the beginning, right? You have a BIM execution plan for your facility information model. Everything's been mapped according to Archibus. You've got the mapping done. Then what should happen, if any changes have been made offline, meaning disconnected from the database, right, so that they're not in sync, then the first thing you can do is simply click on catalog and say, I want to catalog all the spaces or equipment or furniture in the model. In this case, I'm going to go floor by floor, and you press OK. And the system, it finds all of the rooms and it says, boom, 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 boom. I'm cataloging 70 different rooms. And down below, it'll tell you if there's any validation issues. And it says, in this case, I've successfully cataloged rooms. Now, if I had nothing in my database, I'm going to show you an image of that particular floor. Here it is here. I've got my US BIM building, the first floor, with all the rooms. I've just now cataloged everything. If I had nothing there before, it would now show up here. So as you can see, I've got a first floor data here. I've cataloged the second floor as well. And I've got nothing beyond that. I've got nothing on the ground floor and nothing on the roof, okay? So if I were to, for example, go to the ground level, and I can see there's a room 001, and I only have that one, then what I need to do is connect that ground level, catalog, and view the results. So for example, first thing I have to do is make sure I've got that level connected, which it's not. So I'm going to go and choose the ground level, press OK, and then all of my commands appear available to me. I press catalog on the floor, catalog the rooms, I press OK. It successfully cataloged one room. There are no issues. So if I go back to Archibus, refresh that page and go to look at my ground floor, there's my room 001, 814 square feet. There's the model information, it's the BIM model in the ground level, and there's a unique identifier for that room. So that's all it takes to go through and connect the data back and forth, is make a change and update that change. Now, for example, if I were gonna, this is where it gets kind of funny because I'm gonna make a bad change here, but if I were to, for example, just move that wall way out of the way and change that, it's gonna give me a bunch of errors because that's not really smart, but if I were gonna move this or change this room successfully, I don't know if I'll be able to do it here on this particular floor. See if I can grab another This is not going to be an easy change just to do quickly. Let's see. No, it's not going to, I can't just move walls around. Anyway, if I'm going to make if I were to make a change, like to remove a wall between, let's see, let's try it here. I'm going to get rid of that room, for example, room 220. I'm going to say, by the way, this is telling me it still exists in the database, even though you removed it as an object. If I were to remove that wall there, let's pretend I could just do that and change the size of that room 221, then in theory, Archibus is going to automatically keep that up to date. So I'm going to go back to 01, look for room 220, 221, and in theory, that would have now been updated automatically because that happens. So basically, once you make your link, the data is linked. If you make a change to that data, you change a floor, you add a room, that will automatically update the room area. If you change, move furniture around, that will update the location theoretically, and that all should stay in sync. But if there is some data that's not in sync, for example, maybe you're updating some other parameter that isn't automatically synchronized, then cataloging would kind of help do that. Lastly, once you've made all your changes that you wanted to, you can publish to 2D or 3D, whichever you're going to be using. Now, a lot of Archibus is using two-dimensional floor plans for occupancy, for the workplace application, and so on. So one of the things I always recommend is, of course, just get your 2D drawings in there and make sure you click on 2D and publish the two-dimensional drawing. So you wait a few seconds, it gets published, and now I've published that floor and it's ready, both in terms of data and in terms of graphics in Archibus. Same thing for publishing 3D. I click on publish. I click on publish again. Give it a couple seconds. And this will take that three-dimensional views of the object and throw them into Archibus. Now, after this, I know this cataloging seems too good to be true, but actually it does work pretty well. You'll notice it's not available on this screen in 3 dimensions, but if I go back to a 2-dimensional view, our FM view, for example, and I go to the Archibus login, it doesn't, it's not always going to work. So for example, if I choose to catalog and set this to, let me unselect these guys, and set this to equipment, I know that I haven't mapped equipment yet. So if I go to catalog the current view without actually identifying a unique identifier for each piece of equipment that will map to Archibus's unique identifier, then it's going to tell me the primary key is not complete. I have to go through and make sure that I have a primary key. So cataloging does work great when you've got everything mapped correctly, but obviously it's going to tell you when things are not working. When you haven't done things. And that's where, as we mentioned last time, things like schedules come in. It's good to have schedules of your equipment and furniture so that you can make sure that there's a mapping from, for example, furniture code into Archibus's furniture code, and you can make sure that that gets mapped into the system. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. But like I said, the steps day to day are not that complicated for making the system work. You modify what you need to modify, you run the catalog command, you publish to 2D and 3D, and then, as I said, you go back to Archibus and you run your update area totals to make sure the square footage is updated, and you verify the results. So I'm going to log into Archibus now, go into my space application to look at the results of the two-dimensional floor plan publishing. I get the space console. I'm going to just go back to my filter on this US BIM building. And there I should see a view of I think I was working on the first floor, a view of the first floor. As you'll notice, I published it. That wall between 220 and 221 no longer exists. And now you're just seeing 221. So not only have I got a new graphical image, but I've updated my data as well. So that exists. If I go look at the highlighting and I've got all the data correctly identified, I can see I've got my meeting spaces highlighted, office spaces, service areas, vertical penetrations, workstations, and circulation areas is white, and that's by my recommendation. Now there's a couple spaces, as you can see. I noticed that they're not all connected. So look in this upper right hand corner. you'll see I've got these guys connected. There's a room 202, 203, 221, 268, but this guy in the corner is missing. This guy's missing. And I think I've got another one that's missing down below over here. So I've got some work to do. I have to go back to the model and make sure that everything is connected properly to make sure my areas are correct. But if I look very quickly at my areas, I always develop a little view like this by changing the fields in my view, by selecting the fields I want to see. And then I could create something like this where I can see how many rooms I have. 70 have been synchronized for a total area of 16,861 with a total internal of 16,237. Now it says I've only captured 14,000 square feet in room area, and that's because I didn't capture those 2 or 3 other large rooms. So that's why the total area is not matching the interior gross. So that tells me I've got a little bit of work to do. But then based on the way I've classified the rooms, offices, meeting spaces, vertical penetrations, and so on, I can see that I've got about 15,646 square feet of rentable space, 9,423 square feet of usable space, and the capacity of about 50. You'll notice on floor 2, there's nothing like that. And that's because I haven't gone through and continued to modify the data and update it. So again, you still have to, for example, you still have to go into the room inventory and update your area totals to make sure that all of those numbers we just looked at are correct and they get updated. So again, we just start the job. And as we said before, go back in and verify that that looks pretty good. So I'll go back into the same search again, select that same floor, floor 01, and then again, go ahead and make sure everything's been updated. Okay, and this tells me I've got to go back in the model and I've got to find that room right there, and I've got to place a room there. So you just go ahead again, make the modification by adding a room. So there's my room there. I'll add another room over here. That's 02. And I'm not paying attention to the numbering at this point, but you go through and you set that up, save the file, and you go through the same process again. You recatalog. Oops, gotta get out of my command. You'll recatalog the rooms. Now there's 71, not 70. No issues. And then again, republish. So that's the whole process. We've done it twice now. Okay. And again, if we just flick on that, we should see some updates when we go and refresh. Okay. We'll check on that later, but I'm not going to worry about that too much. That's the basic process. Okay, now, next process was the initial steps. So let's go back and look at our initial steps here for just a minute. We said that to make all of that cataloging work really well and the synchronization keep up to date and the publishing working well, then there are some things that you have to do in advance for each model, well, for all of the models, but then again for each model. So number one, we said we have to make sure we add a step in the business process. That's key. So I've actually worked with clients who put every single process on their catalog, on their workplace catalog, so that if there's a space change, they make a request for the space change, and the Archibus SLA system, which is the workflow system, picks up that step. We can assign a step to the BIM specialist, and they have to actually kind of route a ticket to themselves and complete that part of the process. So that's a good way to do it, I think, because then everything kind of is tied into Archibus. But that doesn't have to be. Whatever workflow tool you're using should have a step to manage and notify the BIM specialist that the change is required in the model. But next, as we get into the properties command and we assign Revit levels to Archibus, we do the mapping, we set up our options, and we do the initial catalog. So let me just run through that to make sure that you understand what has to go into getting this model initially connected to Archibus. First thing is, like we said, you need to have a new building and floor in Archibus, right? So just like we would normally do, I'm going to use the space console for this in this case, although I wouldn't normally do it this way, but we can just stay on the one screen. So normally you'd click on add a new building, you create your building, right? Like whatever that building is, building 1, building 2, give it a name, and then you can create your floors once you have a building created. So again, you go in here and you add floors to your buildings. So again, if I choose my, where's my US BIM building? I choose my BIM building, I can create a new floor. I'll just call it 10 for today and save that. So now I've identified the fact that we have these floors in Archibus, right, for this new building or this new renovated building. Then the first step in the model, and it's a one-time step, is to go down through each of the floors and click on the property command, and this will get your Archibus extension activated. So for example, in this model, we don't have the basement connected. So I'll go in, I've already connected floor 1 and 2 so the system knows that this is that same US BIM building. But then I'll go in and I'll select the floor. And there's my floor 10 that I just created. And here's my rooftop. Now I'm not gonna choose, I don't have a basement. So I'm not gonna, again, I could do it here, but I'll do it here for today, but I wouldn't normally do this in real life. I'll call it B1. This is the typical for basements. Press OK. Okay, now I've added it and press OK. So now I've created that floor in the Archibus database, and I've connected the basement level in Revit to that floor. All my commands are now visible. But if I go to floor 1 and go to properties, you'll see it's already been connected. Floor 1. Floor 2 is the same. Floor 2. And I have to do this with a floor plan in Revit. I can't use a ceiling plan or some other type of plan. I have to do the floor plan. So I'll go to the ground level. I think you saw me do this earlier. We've already connected that as well. So it's connected to ground. And then lastly, I think roof is still disconnected. Roof is not active yet. So I'll click on properties, choose the roof, and press OK. And now I've told Archibus this building and these floors are all going to be linked to Archibus database. And so now I have something to catalog and synchronize. And if I've set up the model really well, if I've got my BIM execution plan set up and the parameters are set up in the model and they're mapped already, all I have to do is catalog, and it does work quite nicely. I mean, it's scary how nice and easy it can be when you've got the data mapped correctly. But like I said, not everybody's going to have that nice, perfect world scenario. So after you assign the levels to floors, you do have to think about the mapping. Okay. Over on the synchronization tab, there is something called map database fields. If you already agree with Archibus's engineers about the default mapping, then you can go in here and specify for each asset type, equipment, rooms, areas, and tag furniture, what objects are going to be, what Revit category and family are going to be assigned to rooms. So as you can see, when I first go in here, it shows me that rooms are actually connected already to areas and rooms in Revit. And they can even have specific families if it's for equipment or furniture or something. And what I do now is I go in and I map the Revit parameter, area, category, export to IFC, division, design option, level, name, number, whatever it is, to the appropriate Archibus field. So area in Revit can be mapped directly to area in Archibus. Department code, which is an Archibus parameter, can be mapped to the corresponding Archibus field. But Revit has a department field, so you don't have to use the Archibus one. You can use the Revit one. So that's fine too. Level probably is a built-in parameter. We don't need that because Archibus is automatically using it. But for example, I always will take the name parameter in Revit and map it to the room name field in Archibus. That's not by default, but this is something that I usually change because I like to use that. The number field is usually populated in Revit. That's your tag number, and I can populate that with room code. But I know all of you have to decide, do we use the room tag, the signage, as the Archibus identifier, or do we use something else? Well, with Revit, in Archibus, you can do either one. However you want to capture information about the tag versus the identifier, it's up to you. There are two places to do that. So you can have your identifier in Revit, match your identifier in Archibus, and the tag number being the name with the room name field in Archibus. So that's quite nice as well. And then you have your categories and standards and everything else like you would normally have in Archibus. This is one way of mapping the parameters. But like I said, there is something else that you can do, which is if you don't like the way that Archibus has mapped the objects to the tables, you can go and change that as well. So I'm going to have to show you this in the Smart Client because I think this is the only place. They might have added it recently in Web Central, but historically it's always been in here that you have to go and do this. But in the Smart Client, the administrator can go into a table called AFM BIM families. Okay, and this table, AFM BIM families, is where you can go and assign a Revit object Like for example, a new object that's been designed by the vendor to an Archibus table, like the equipment table, the furniture table, and so on. I've run into some error here, so Archibus didn't like whatever I just did. But anyway, this table here, I'll just open this back up and run it again. But that table is where you can identify each object and the tables that the objects belong to. We'll just get rid of all this stuff here. We'll open up the Smart Client again. And we're just about out of time, so I'll try to finish this up here. Okay, so this AFM BIM family table will show you the Revit category. Like by default, Archibus assigns specialty equipment, electrical equipment, and fire alarm devices, security devices, all to the equipment table. But if you wanted to change that, if you wanted to change those and put them into the network device table or the door table, for example, or the wall table, you can create this mapping of Archibus, a Revit object to Archibus table. Once you have that mapping, then that's where the set over to Revit here. That's where this map database fields comes in. And this exists here, but for those of you who are familiar with Archibus, it also exists over here in a table called AFM BIM parameters. So now for all the equipment that's mapped, all of the fields, building, equipment ID, equipment standard, floor ID, they have corresponding parameter names. So that's the Revit parameter. And for example, for furniture and equipment in Revit, I will almost always choose the mark parameter as the ID in Archibus. Same thing for equipment. I'll use the mark parameter in Revit as the equipment ID in Archibus. So I often do that, and that's probably what's missing, currently from this model is a mark number. So that's why we couldn't catalog equipment. But you can do the mapping here, or you can do the mapping here. It's the same set of groupings, and you can change this in either place. But that mapping gets done once, and once that's done, when you catalog, the catalog knows how to push data from Archibus from Revit into Archibus. It also knows, for example, how to read data from Archibus into the Revit model if there are some fields that you want to populate directly from Archibus and keep up to date in the facility information model. So it does go both ways if you use read database fields or catalog. There's a lot of other things we can talk about. So this is not a Revit training for for the extension, but in terms of getting things ready, assigning the levels to floors, mapping the data correctly, those are the key steps. And once you get that done, the next thing you might have to look into is the publishing parameters. I'll just, again, quickly show you where those are. It is worth taking a second to go into the advanced publishing and making sure that each of these object areas have the correct objects assigned to them. So for example, electrical objects for the building should have all the electrical categories from Revit assigned. So I might, for example, notice that lighting fixtures has not been included in the publishing. I can go and add that over here. Or I can see, oh, rooms is included. I can remove rooms because I don't need that. I get that somewhere else. So I always kind of go in here and just make sure these look good to me for the model that I'm working with. Because by default, Archibus will have these particular categories in the publishing for these particular objects that you're going to see in Web Central, but they might not apply to all your models. Your models might have different categories. So you want to make sure that these are all set the way that you like and make sure those categories are correct. For two-dimensional publishing, there is sometimes in different versions of Archibus, you can control the colors and the layers that get generated via the CAD formats. And I think it's the DGN if I'm not mistaken. But under the DGN format, there'll be an actual way to go in and identify what layers are available. And you can go in here and look at those layers and make, in some cases, modify them, modify the color and so on. So there is some control there available to you as well, so that ultimately you're in control of not just the data that's being pushed into Archibus, but the image that's being pushed into Archibus as well. And then, like I said, once that mapping is set up, in theory, you'll be able to catalog those objects and then make sure everything's cataloged by using the BIM Explorer and making sure that everything's been highlighted that exists, that needs to be highlighted, that needs to be connected. If something's not connected, making sure that you go in there and catalog those items as well. So those are kind of some of the default steps that go into getting that facility information model ready for Archibus. And the end result is you'll have something like these models where you can see the floor plan. You can highlight by the data that you've created on the floor. As you can see, I've filled out number 1. You can validate the data here on the screen to make sure that your areas in Revit are correct and that Archibus is reporting on them correctly. And of course, here comes the bells and the whistles. You can turn that model into a 3-dimensional view, just like you have in the Revit model, and you can turn on the areas that you want to play with: site areas, shell, core areas, HVAC, piping, interior walls, and so on. And when you click on these, you have total control over what objects are appearing, because these are controlled by that publishing step. So what you click on here is going to show or turn on or turn off whatever shows up here. So that's going to affect these objects, that what gets turned on and off. So I can turn on the room objects and see just furniture and equipment, and I can choose what floors I want to play with by selecting the individual floors. Some objects which are system wide, so they go through the whole building, they'll always stay depending on what you want to show. But depending, if you want to look at room-based information or space or furniture information, those will show up by floor. And then you can actually do all your highlighting and everything else just like we did. So if I wanted to highlight, for example, by category, I can see that I've got categories on floor 1, and there's my space allocation plan for floor 1 in 3 dimensions. So again, you can go ahead and have fun with that and decide how you want to do it, but ultimately what you're showing in the model or in Archibus should represent almost exactly what you have in your Revit file. And if we look at the 3-dimensional plans, that's what we're looking at. We're trying to get this Revit information into Archibus so that we can go and play with it. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I ran a few minutes over here. We now should give you some time for some questions and answers, but let's just summarize today's session. After you get your facility information model, you get it prepared for Archibus, you get the data mapped correctly, then your job during the operations of the building is to keep that FIM model in sync. We'll keep it BIM in sync. But ultimately what it comes down to is making sure that you execute those initial steps conscientiously, meaning you set up the mapping of buildings and floors to equipment, that you map the tables and fields from the Revit models to the Archibus database, and then make sure that model synchronization is a part of the business process. So every day, every time part of that building changes, that BIM specialist gets notified. He opens up the file, he catalogs, he publishes, and the benefit at the end of the day is that you have up-to-date graphical representation of your area and equipment systems in your FM environment. So thank you very much, everybody. Today was Keep BIM in Sync. And in 2 weeks, we'll be running another session that's focused on Archibus's preventive maintenance application, but we're going to call it Automate and Track Scheduled Jobs, because it's not just about maintenance, it's about any routine job that you have to keep track of. So having said that, now we've got about 10 minutes left to answer any questions that you may have. If you have any questions, hopefully you've been entering them into the chat or the question panel. And Ian will take over at this point and read out some of the questions, and hopefully we have some discussion. So again, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sean. Like he said, if you guys have any questions on BIM and facilities data inputting, throw them in the chat, and I'll monitor it for the next couple minutes to see if anybody has any. I'll just give it a second to see if there's any being submitted. But like he said, there's another one on asset and preventative maintenance. I know preventative maintenance is on everybody's priority list. Preventative maintenance in 2 weeks, as well as, and another thing is the recording for this will be uploaded tomorrow afternoon, and you will get an email. Actually, not tomorrow afternoon, tomorrow's Easter, so on Monday. Good thing I remembered that. Sean, it doesn't appear that we have any questions coming in the chat, so I think everybody's pretty square with this. In that case, thank you everybody for attending once again. We'll have an email coming out in the next couple of weeks on the next couple of sessions. Like I said, preventative maintenance, as well as the link to the new recordings. And if you would like the slideshow as well on top of that, reach out to me and I'll have it available and I can send it over to you as well. Thank you all for attending once again, and we'll see you next time.